Hey everyone, we're going to feed a Templar Knight tonight. This is a monk who fights and has taken vows of poverty, obedience, and not having fun. Then they sat down every day to eat meals that were meant to make them unhappy. So before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights, and let's take it easy as we start our journey tonight. It wasn't eating to feed a Templar Knight. It wasn't a meal. It was a logistical step taken to stop things from falling apart. Think less about the banquet and more about the human maintenance window. The goal was clear: keep the knight alive, standing up, and able to wear a lot of metal without passing out. The Templar didn't eat because they liked it. Pleasure was not to be trusted. When people were happy, they smiled, and when they smiled, they often asked questions. Questions led to discussions, and talks led to not following the rules. The safest thing to do was to eat something bland, agree with yourself, and go on with your day. The Knights Templar were warrior monks, which meant they combined the most boring parts of monastic life with the most tiring parts of war. They got their discipline, silence, and deep mistrust of fun from monks. They got their need for calories, strength, and the ability to march long distances while pretending to be fine from soldiers. So, their meals were in a narrow emotional space that was filling, repetitive, and humbling for the soul. If someone said food was interesting, they had already made a mistake. A Templar did not look at menus. He didn't ask for suggestions. He didn't say things like, "I don't really want lentils today." What he got was the same thing everyone else got, and it was chosen because no one would be excited about it. Excitement was risky. Excitement caused attachment. Connection made people want. Wanting something made it hard to focus. When I was distracted, I thought about things other than duty, God, and not dying violently. That was not okay. The meals were planned so that people wouldn't overeat. The portions were big enough, but not very exciting. The ingredients were useful, long-lasting, and not too emotional. There were spices, but not enough to make you think they could have used more. Even the act of eating had strict rules. No rushing, no hanging around, and no big reactions. You chewed, then you swallowed. You thought about obedience in silence. You didn't tell anyone how much you liked the meal. In modern terms, feeding a Templar Knight was more like filling up a siege engine that prayed every now and then than it was like dinner. Calories were important. It was important to be consistent. But personal happiness did not. The diet kept bodies strong, minds focused, and morale low enough to keep dangerous thoughts like, "What if life could be nicer?" from happening. Comfort was not the goal. Survival was. The Templars said that this is what survival tasted like. Let's set the record straight right away. If you thought of a group of armored knights sitting around a table, eating dinner and laughing and talking, the Templar dining hall was not very lively. It wasn't friendly. In an emotional sense, it wasn't warm. There was enough silence for you to hear bread being broken and souls being changed, the Templars ate their meals in almost complete silence, not because they didn't like people, but because silence was part of the discipline. Talking made people more unique. Personality promoted uniqueness. Individuality was a slippery slope that led to opinions, preferences, and finally someone asking why dinner always tasted like regret. Instead of talking, people read during meals. While everyone ate, they read aloud from the Bible the rules of the order or moral lessons. Nothing makes chewing on dense bread better than being reminded of your many spiritual flaws, your need to be obedient, and your need to be humble. If you didn't want to say anything about the food. You didn't ask for the salt, though. You definitely didn't want to say that the soup tasted like boiled despair. People expected silence. Everyone at the table was judging you quietly, and social pressure made you do it. The dining hall itself added to this feeling. There were long wooden tables, hard benches, and no cushions or personal space. You sat next to other knights and ate the same food as them. Same speed, all acting like they didn't see each other. It was fair, but it was also uncomfortable. There wasn't much eye contact. Lingering glances suggested that someone was distracted. Distraction suggested the need for temptation. Temptation made me think of weakness. Paperwork was suggested by weakness. No one wanted to do paperwork. You weren't even supposed to chew. Eating loudly got people's attention. Correction drew attention. Correction made people feel bad. The safest thing to do was to chew slowly and carefully, with your eyes down and your thoughts politely directed away from hunger and toward discipline. And yet, in this quiet, the Templars found order. Because there was no talking, meals were less interesting. Eating became automatic, predictable, and efficient. Exactly how the order wanted it. This was more like a spiritual assembly line than a family dinner. Food went in, energy came out, and character was shaped in the middle. No one stayed at the table for fun because of the silence. You ate, listened, and then you were done. Then you got up and went back to work, a little less, hungry and a little more obedient than before, because even meals were a form of training in the Templar world. Training in self-control, training in concentration, and training in the noble art of not saying anything when you really wanted to. There was no meat, wine, or anything else exciting in the Templar diet. It was bread. Bread that never stops, is always there, and is never happy. Bread wasn't a side dish. It was the basis for every meal, every day, and maybe even every Templar jaw. This bread was not soft. This was not bread from a bakery. This was not the kind of bread you could tear apart with your hands and smile. This bread was heavy, dark, and rough, and it was made from barley or a mix of grains. Bread with a goal. Bread that didn't want to be eaten. Bread that needed dedication. A Templar didn't just eat bread for fun. He interacted with it. Chewing was something to do. A knight's jaw got stronger over time, but not from fighting. It got stronger from dealing with bread that wouldn't cooperate over and over again. People quietly and internally liked fresh bread. It was normal to have stale bread. People expected the bread to be rock hard. It was not thrown away when the bread was at the point where it could be used to fix a wall. It was soaked in broth and eaten anyway. It was wrong to waste. Hunger taught us things. Bread was always on the table because it solved a lot of problems at once. It filled up the stomach. It was easy to store. It moved well. It didn't ask anything of you emotionally. You could walk for hours on just bread, as long as you were okay with the fact that joy was no longer part of the deal. It also made discipline stronger. Every day, bread was the same, predictable and dependable. It was your fault if you started to want more variety. The breads were fine. The bread was doing what it was supposed to do. Even the act of breaking bread was planned. No ripping off big pieces, no stockpiling. Everyone got the same amount because the portions were controlled, equal distribution of carbohydrates. And bread did more than just fill you up. It soaked up soups, stews, and sauces, turning thin liquids into something that looked like a meal. So, bread wasn't just food. It was a tool, a sponge, and a way to deal with things. There was no ceremony for it, no praise, no thinking about how it tastes. You ate bread because it was there. Bread was like a protein bar for the Templars in modern times. Bland, effective, and eaten with the knowledge that it wasn't meant to make you happy. It was probably bread that a Templar dreamed about. He only ever complained about food to himself while he was chewing, and if he ever thought, there has to be more to life than this, the bread was there to remind him, no, there is not. At this point, you might be wondering when the Templars finally got to the good part. The meats that were cooked, the fat that dripped, and the heroic chewing. This is where expectations sit down and think about the choices they've made. Yes, the Knights of the Templar ate meat. No, it wasn't a celebration every day. Meat was controlled, planned, and made to be boring. It came out on certain days, as the rules said it should, and was made in such a way that it left no trace of excitement. You joined the wrong order if you were hoping for a barbecue from the Middle Ages. When meat came, it was usually boiled or stewed, not roasted, not heavily seasoned, and not shown off. Boiled, there were many benefits to this method. It made tough cuts softer, stretched portions, and got rid of anything that looked like indulgence. It also made sure that the meat tasted exactly how the Templars wanted it to taste. Food with no emotional connection. Beef and mutton were the most common meats. Pork. It was there, but it wasn't a favorite. Some people thought pork was bad for your morals because it was fatty, made people too happy, and some people always thought it was bad for your morals. Poultry showed up from time to time, but never in a formal way. People ate chickens with the same enthusiasm as they would show for doing paperwork. There were limits on how much food you could eat. You weren't eating enough to fill you up. You ate until you weren't hungry enough to complain about it anymore. It was not a good idea to eat too much. Gluttony was a sin. People who enjoyed things too much were looked at with suspicion. And no, having a higher rank did not get you more meat. A knight did not get more than a sergeant. Being equal at the table made people more likely to obey in other places. The answer was no. if you thought your bravery on the battlefield got you an extra piece. And the silence after that no was very strong. People thought that meat made them stronger, but it was also dangerous. Eating too much meat gave me too much energy. Too much energy made people restless. Restlessness made me think. Questions came from thoughts. Why there was so much boiled food in life. The safest amount of meat was just enough to get by. Meat was treated like a drug in a Templar diet. Allowed, but only in small amounts and with close monitoring. You got it because your body needed it, not because you wanted it. Yes, Templars did eat meat, but they did it like they did everything else, without flair, without joy, and without letting it get any ideas. A Templar Knight might start to think, ah, yes, meet again. Life is improving. The calendar quietly stepped in. Enter the days of fasting, and there were a lot of them. On those days, there was no meat, only fish. After all, nothing says spiritual discipline like eating something that smells like it doesn't want to exist. Days when you could eat fish were not uncommon. They were a regular part of Templar life, coming every week and for long periods of the religious year. The goal was simple: to hold back. People thought meat was rich. People thought fish was humble, and humility, like bread and silence, was something that the order thought you could never have too much of. This fish was not fresh and showy from the ocean. This was fish from the Middle Ages: salted fish, dried fish, smoked fish, and fish that had traveled a long way and had a lot of time to think about what would happen to it. When it got to the table, it was more of a lesson than a meal. Fish that had been salted was very common. It stayed fresh, was easy to carry, and lasted forever. It might last longer than the night eating it. The bad thing was that it tasted exactly like what it was: fish that had been forcefully given salt and then left alone to think. Changing the way you cook didn't help. Fish was usually boiled or stewed, sometimes with vegetables, sometimes plain, and always without an apology. People didn't use a lot of spices because too much flavor could make the food taste good, which wasn't the goal. Fish meals made people more obedient. You ate fish because the rules said you had to, not because you wanted to. Complaining would have done nothing, except for disappointment inside. The right thing to do was to accept it quietly and chew slowly. Fish days were also useful in a practical way. They gave the body a break from heavy meats and made it easier for people in areas where meat was hard to find or expensive. A combination that the Templars really liked because it was good for their souls and their wallets. In today's language, fish days were like required meals that someone made you eat even if you didn't like them. Healthy, smart, and very boring. But fish kept the Templars alive, working and following orders, which meant the order was doing a great job. When fish came to the table, no one cheered or complained. They just ate, knowing that they might get meat or more fish tomorrow. If bread was the main food for Templars, and fish was the test of obedience, then vegetables were the hard workers who kept the whole system running smoothly. They weren't very pretty. They weren't honored. They were just there, always fed patiently, in bowls, stews, and pots, doing the nutritional work that no one else wanted to take credit for. People didn't pick Templar vegetables for their taste. They were picked because they were easy to grow, easy to store, and didn't make people feel attached to them. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, lentils, peas, and other vegetables that knew what they were supposed to do and didn't want to be famous. Onions were always there. They were cheap, long-lasting, and could make plain food taste like it had a personality for a short time. People also liked leeks, especially in stews, where they blended in like obedient monks of the vegetable world. People grew cabbage when they remembered to, and when they did, it stayed for a long time, both in storage and in memory. Legumes did most of the work. Lentils and beans were filling, full of protein, and very dedicated to being boiled until they lost all their unique qualities. A pot of lentils could feed you for many nights and meals, and all you had to do was wait and not expecting much. Vegetables also had an important moral role. They were simple, humble, and down to earth. Eating them made me think that pleasure was a choice, and self-control was a good thing. No one has ever looked at a bowl of boiled cabbage and wanted to eat too much. Mission accomplished. Getting ready was easy. Chop up the vegetables, put them in a pot, boil them, and add salt every now and then. There were herbs, but they were used carefully, as if the taste itself could lead to sin. The result was food that filled the stomach but didn't make the mind work. But these vegetables kept the Templars going. They gave us energy for training, food that didn't upset our stomachs, and meals that we could eat every day without any problems. Vegetables are a great fit for a life that is built on routine. In modern terms, vegetables were like meal prep for the Templars. Dependable, predictable, nutritionally sound, and emotionally distant. No one said anything nice about them. No one missed them when they left. But the whole system would have quietly fallen apart without vegetables, which is how the Templars like things to work. Soup was the one thing that the Templars really knew how to make. Not because they liked it, but because soup was the logical endpoint of how they saw the world. Soup was useful. The soup did what it was told. There were no questions or excitement needed for soup. If you weren't sure what to do, everything went into a pot. The bread was too hard to chew. Soup. Vegetables that look tired. Soup. Meat that is too tough to fake. You liked it. Soup. Fish that had been through 3 areas and lost all hope. Soup, for sure. Soup quietly fixed problems, which made it the perfect food for an order that liked quiet solutions. Most of the time, Templar soups were thick stews instead of light broths. Thin soup made it seem like there wasn't much food. Thick soup made it seem like you were in charge. A good stew could be ladled, stretched, reheated, and served again tomorrow with little effort and no emotional investment. It wasn't laziness if a pot lasted for a few days. That was efficiency. Soup also had a structural function. Do you remember the bread that breaks jaws and kills excitement? It got softer with soup. Knights dipped their bread into the pot so that it could soak up the liquid and become soft enough to eat again. In this way, soup worked more like a tool for fixing things then a dish. What went into a template stew changed from day to day. Lentils, beans, onions, cabbage, leeks, small pieces of meat, and sometimes fish. When the ingredients went into the pot, they lost their uniqueness. Everything turned into stew. Differences were no longer there. We reached equality. There weren't many spices. Salt was the norm. Herbs showed up from time to time, just enough to remind everyone that flavor was possible in theory, but not in practice. There were worries about a stew that tasted too good. If the stew tasted okay, it was doing its job. Soup was also useful during campaigns. Big pots could quickly feed a lot of men. It didn't need any special tools, exact timing, or personal taste. You ate what you were given at the pace set by the ladle. In modern terms, soup was the Templars' way of cooking a lot of food at once. Men who thought happiness was a waste of time prepared meals. Everyone said the soup was bad. No one said anything bad about the soup. It was real. It got warmer. It got full. In the Templar way of thinking, that was the best thing. Soup would have been a strong candidate if you could have made a religion out of food. If you're wondering if a hungry Templar could just take more food, the answer is no, and not a soft no. A very firm institutional number. There was no suggestion for portion control. It was a rule. Eating was as strictly controlled as prayer times and discipline on the battlefield. A Templar did not eat until he was full. He ate until he wasn't hungry anymore. There is a difference. Being full made it easier to relax. Relaxation made things more comfortable. Comfort was once again suspicious. The food was divided up so that each man got the same amount. It was very important to have equality at the table. If one knight got more, anger followed, resentment led to ideas, thoughts caused trouble. The safest way was to have the same bowls, the same portions, and the same disappointment. It was rare to get a second helping, and you had to ask for it. You couldn't just reach forward and fill your bowl like you would at a village feast. That would have gotten people talking, and that was never a good thing. Attention indicated desire. Wanting too much was suggested. Too much suggested weakness, and being weak in the Templar world was a problem. The system also helped people control themselves. You learned how to take your time. If you ate too quickly, you would be left with an empty bowl while everyone else chewed in silence. If you ate too slowly, the meal would end anyway. Timing was important. Being disciplined was important. Managing hunger became a skill. Interestingly, people thought that controlling portions was good for their spirits. A little bit of hunger kept the mind sharp and the soul humble. A Templar who was a little hungry after a meal was thought to have eaten enough. A Templar who felt satisfied may require contemplation. There were also practical benefits to this method. The supplies lasted longer. There was less waste. No one became reliant on plenty. The order could last through long campaigns and tough conditions because no one expected to be pampered. This was like modern-day enforced mindful eating, but there was no mindfulness, joy, or choice, just discipline. But this system did work. Knights stayed in shape, could move around, and were able. No sluggishness, no food comas, just steady energy and a constant, a low level of awareness, of restraint. Like everything else in a Templar's life, portion control taught the same lesson. You take what you were given, you don't ask for more, and you keep going anyway. Being hungry was not a failure. It was a part of it. You might think that if food was tightly controlled, drink would be even worse at this point. Wine was allowed, but not in the way you might think. This was not happy wine. This was not wine for talking about our feelings. This was wine. Treated like an adult who knows how to take medicine. Helpful, careful, and not always trustworthy. It was okay for Templar knights to drink wine because the water in the Middle Ages was often not safe, sometimes hostile, and sometimes trying to kill you. Wine was safer, especially when it was watered down. The word that matters here is diluted. People thought that undiluted wine was too much, dangerous, and suspiciously close to being enjoyable. So, wine was mixed with water to make it less strong and to make sure that no one had fun by mistake. This made a drink that tasted like a careful balance between safety and disappointment. A lot of alcohol to keep bacteria away. Not enough to make people talk or make bad choices. It was against the rules to be drunk. A Templar who was drunk was more than just embarrassing. He was a threat. Judgment was important. Discipline was important. And nothing breaks discipline faster than someone loudly saying they could definitely fight 3 men while leaning on a table. People drank wine quietly and in small amounts, usually with meals. You didn't take your time with it and think about the smell. You drank it to stay hydrated and get on with your duties. It wasn't important that you noticed the taste. There were also rules about who could serve the wine and how much they could pour. You can't get more without asking. No cups left over. The cup came, did its job, and then went away, just like happiness in a Templar's life. Wine also helped to bring people together in a social way. Everyone drank the same thing and the same amount. Rank did not bring better wine. A knight. The commander didn't get a better vintage than the newest brother. Once again, mild dissatisfaction was used to enforce equality. In modern times, wine for a Templar was like coffee at work. It was allowed, controlled, and meant to keep you working instead of making you happy. You were probably doing it wrong if you liked it too much. So yes, Templars drank wine, but they did it carefully, quietly, and always knowing that too much pleasure was much worse than thirst. Wine was not a way to get away. One of the most radical ideas in modern dining is choice. Menus, options, preferences, allergies, and the ability to say, actually, I'm not in the mood for that. None of this was possible in a Templar dining hall. It wasn't an accident that choice was taken away. It was taken off on purpose. A Templar Knight didn't have any preferences. He might have had some a long time ago, but he gave them up when he signed away his personality and got a white cloak in return. From then on, you couldn't choose what you ate anymore. It was something you got. There was no asking what was for dinner. There was no hope for a better tomorrow. There was definitely no what's going to say, I don't really like fish. Not liking food was something you kept to yourself and never told anyone else. Expressing a preference showed that you cared. Attachment indicated desire. Wanting something made you seem weak. Being weak was always a pain. This lack of choice was part of the training. You eat what is put in front of you every day without saying anything. Learn a very specific lesson. Your comfort is not the most important thing. Do what you're told, and if you can learn that lesson at the table, you will be much more likely to learn it on the battlefield. Not only were the meals the same in terms of what was in them, but also in how they were experienced. Same bowls, same amount of food, same quiet. There was nothing wrong with the lack of variety. That was a feature. Variety made people want to compare. Comparison made people unhappy. Being unhappy made people think. And thinking too much got them into trouble. Not even rank did. Make this different. A senior knight did not get a different meal. A commander did not get a secret boost. Everyone ate the same thing at the same time and in the same way. Enforced indifference leads to equality. The Templar dining system was the opposite of what we think of as customer service today. The order didn't care if you liked the food. You weren't supposed to have the meal. You were there to place the order. Something interesting happened over time. Knights stopped thinking that food would make them happy. They stopped looking forward to meals. The point was that eating became neutral, automatic, and unremarkable. When food doesn't bother you anymore, when comfort isn't important anymore, and when preference doesn't matter anymore, you become very easy to control. And that was always on the menu, more than just flavor. In most medieval societies, being high up in the social order came with benefits. Better clothes, better food, and better homes. Your plate usually followed you up the social ladder. The Knights Templar thought about this idea and it looked at it carefully and then took it out completely. In the order, rank did not make your meals better. A new brother, a veteran knight, and a high-ranking commander all ate the same food in the same amounts, cooked the same way. Having power didn't get you more meat. Being a leader did not unlock better bread. Dessert was not part of the promotion. This was not a mistake. It was the rule. The Templars thought that being equal at the table made people more obedient in other areas as well. If leaders, when they ate better, they got angry. If leaders ate poorly, their power diminished. The safest thing to do was to make everyone feel the same way. Being unhappy together brought people closer together. The master of a commandery ate the same food as everyone else. Same soup, same bread, same watered-down wine. He could have stayed a noble if he wanted luxury. The order was very clear. You didn't get ahead of your brothers by eating differently. This also took away a strong source of drive. You couldn't move up in the ranks. For comfort, you couldn't get better food by being obedient. Getting ahead meant taking on more responsibility, not getting more power. So people who wanted power for their own gain usually lost interest very quickly. At meals, rank was one of the few places where it didn't matter at all. There were no special seats, no better bowls, and no secret kitchen privileges. Just long tables, the same amount of food for everyone, and the unspoken agreement that no one was special at the moment. This made things easier from a practical point of view. Kitchens made one meal for everyone. All the supplies were given out evenly. No complicated hierarchies of ingredients, and no accounting problems. Discipline and efficiency went together. This was very radical in today's world. Picture a place of work where the CEO eats lunch with everyone else every day and doesn't complain. Now, think about having lentil stew and hard bread for lunch. You start to see how much work it takes. The lack of culinary privilege strengthens the order's main point. You are here to help others, not to be helped. You don't lead by what you want, but by what you do. In the world of the Templars, power didn't taste better. It tasted the same. At this point, it should be clear that giving a Templar Knight food was never just about food. It was training that never stopped, was always quiet, and went on long after the armor came off. Every meal was meant to train the mind as well as the body. Eating plain food without complaining taught self-control. Eating the same things trained endurance every day. Eating in silence helped me focus. Even a little bit of hunger taught acceptance. The table was just another place to practice, but with fewer swords and more lentils. The Templars knew something that many people today forget. It's easiest to be disciplined when things are small and boring. Anyone can be disciplined when they charge into battle in a dramatic way. That's what adrenaline does. When you're tired, hungry, and looking at as another bowl of the same stew, that's when real discipline shows up. Meals made stronger. Every day, same time, same place, and same rules. The predictability took decision away completely. You didn't think about food. You didn't see it coming. You weren't looking forward to it. You just did what the schedule had said. This made it easier to pray, do your duty, and not die violently later. The diet itself helped with endurance instead of explosive strength. These men were supposed to march long distances, stand guard for hours, and fight even when they were tired. Heavy, indulgent meals would have made things slow down. Them down. Simple food kept my energy up and my digestion working well. No big deal, no risk. Even stopping when your bowl was empty was a form of training. You learned to know your limits and not argue with them. You learned that just because you wanted more didn't mean you would get it. This lesson affected every part of Templar life. In modern terms, this was dinner that was really behavioral conditioning. No need for motivational speeches or yelling. Just do it over and over again. Until following orders became second nature, and it worked over time. Knights learned to deal with pain. They learned to work without getting anything fun as a reward. Hunger, boredom, and doing the same thing over and over again stopped being problems and became background noise. That made them very strong. They did what they were told when orders came. They put up with bad weather. They were able to adapt when food was hard to come by because they had been doing it all along. For a Templar, eating was not a break from training. It was one of them. At some point, every Templar Knight had to deal with hunger. Not dramatic, painful starvation, but a quiet, constant feeling that another bowl would have been nice. People didn't think this was a problem. It was actually seen as a good thing. The Templars thought that being a little hungry was good for the soul. A knight who left the table a little hungry was not starving. He was punished the right way. Hunger made people more aware, made them more humble, and stopped the dangerous idea that life was meant to be at ease. Comfort was once again suspicious. Being full made me sleepy. Being sleepy made my mind wander. Thoughts that wandered made me think. Too much reflection led to questions, and questions weren't often helpful for a company that was based on following orders and being clear. On the other hand, a knight who was a little hungry stayed alert, focused, and not as interested in philosophical debates. Hunger also made everyone equal. Everyone could feel it. Everyone had to deal with it. If everyone at the table got up from a meal with the same feint, dissatisfaction, harmony was maintained. Being uncomfortable together was a strong way to bring people together. It made each man remember that he was part of something bigger than just his own needs. There was also a spiritual side. Medieval Christianity considered hunger a means of discipline and purification. For a long time, people have used fasting to strengthen their will and calm their body's needs. The Templars didn't fast all the time, but they were close enough to hunger that it never felt strange. It was familiar, almost comforting in a strange way. Accepting hunger made things easier from a practical point of view. The supplies lasted longer, rations lasted longer. When food ran out, campaigns could keep going without getting scared. A knight that is used to having a lot of things goes by quickly when they are gone. A knight who is used to holding back hardly notices the change. This was deliberate discomfort training in modern terms. It wasn't too much or too cruel. It was just enough to change expectations. The goal was not to hurt the body, but to take away its power. Over time, hunger lost its strength. It stopped needing attention. Like the sound of marching boots or the weight of armor, it became background noise. Something you saw, acknowledged, and then moved on from. A Templar was not afraid of being hungry. He didn't go after fullness. He accepted the space in between. And in that space, the order thought discipline lived. Being hungry was not a failure. It was a lesson. By now, it should be clear that food was more than just keeping a Templar alive. It was showing him something that happens all the time, quietly, and without stopping. The lessons were easy, and every meal was a lesson. Obedience, self-control, and the knowledge that life isn't made to make you happy. The Templars thought that the body wasn't an enemy, but it wasn't in charge either. One of the easiest ways to remind it of that was to give it food. Plain meals taught people to be humble. Repetition taught me to be patient. Controlled portions taught how to control oneself. And not giving in to temptation taught something even more important. You might be able to live without getting what you wanted. This wasn't a mistake. The order knew more about how people think than it let on. If you teach a man to follow rules when he is tired and hungry, he will follow them when he is well rested and scared. He will be able to handle hard times on the march if you teach him to handle disappointment at the table. Even the taste mattered. Food that was too good made people stay. Lingering invited connection. Attachment made people want to be comfortable outside of the table, so meals were kept. Deliberately neutral, not bad enough to make people rebel, not good enough to make people want it. A perfect mix of fine and that will do. Food also helped people feel like they belonged. You weren't an individual showing taste, you were a brother who followed a rule that everyone else did too. Eating the same food at the same time, in the same way, took away people's uniqueness and gave them a sense of belonging. It was clear what the message was. You are part of something bigger, and that thing eats lentils. Every bite also had a moral warning in it. Too much was dangerous. Wanting something was distracting. Pleasure wasn't bad, but it wasn't necessary either. The Templars didn't want to hurt the body. They were trying to stop it from making deals. This was behavioral conditioning that looked like nutrition in modern times. No speeches, no dramatic ceremonies, just doing the same thing every day until the lesson stuck. Food taught the knight to accept limits, to resist impulse, and to value purpose over pleasure. And when you live that lesson every day, it doesn't feel like a restriction anymore. It begins to feel normal. The Templar diet really helped people reach their goals, not strength or endurance, but the slow change of what you expect. A knight didn't just eat when he got up from the table. He had been told again what kind of person he should be. In the end, it was never about food for the Templar Knight. The food was just the way to get it there. The real goal was to keep a life going that was based on obedience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance that comfort wasn't part of the deal. Every meal sent the same message. You are not here for your own sake. The bread that was hard to chew, the soup that tasted just like yesterday's soup, and the fish that showed up more often than anyone wanted, the portions that stopped just before they were full. All of it came together to make a knight who didn't expect much and put up with a lot. The Templars did not try to make men strong by giving them a lot of food. They taught them to be strong by making them live without luxury. A knight who could fight, pray, march, and think clearly on simple food was a knight who would not fall apart when things got worse, which they always did. This diet changed bodies. Yes, thin, strong, and able to work for a long time. But more importantly, it changed what people thought would happen. A Templar didn't wake up hoping for a good meal. He got up thinking about his duty. Food just helped that expectation, like armor protects the body by being heavy, limiting, and necessary. And this system worked. The order kept discipline for generations, even in hostile places, over long distances and under a lot of stress. They walked in a line, guarded, and fought without needing anything more than a goal and a plan. Their meals were not prizes. They were habits. In modern language, feeding a Templar Knight was more like taking care of a machine than hosting a person. You gave it what it needed. Nothing more, nothing less. If the machine complained, It was a problem that needed to be fixed, not a request that needed to be honored. That makes me feel uneasy and impressed at the same time. The Templars built an identity because they lived in a world that was obsessed with comfort, about self control. They showed that you could live without pleasure and still do well, not happily, not comfortably, but in a way that works. So, when you think of a Templar at the table, don't think of them eating. Imagine someone chewing quietly, sitting up straight, with their eyes down, not looking forward to dessert, just fuel, just obedience, and getting ready for whatever came next. That was always enough for a Templar knight, just a knight. Empress Fang did not make history by winning or conquering. She went in. It through loss. She was born into the powerful Fang clan in the 5th century. Her early life was spent in the brutal world of Northern Wei court politics, where power changed hands quickly and mercy was hard to come by. When her family was targeted in political purges, their status fell almost overnight. Adult men were killed or sent away. Women and children were taken in by the palace system and lost their old identities. Fang was still a child when she was brought into the imperial household, but not as a royal. As a consort in training, she lived a life of silence, obedience, and constant watching. The Northern Wei court was not a nice place to be. It was a machine based on rituals, doubt, and power. There was meaning in every gesture. It was possible to say every word again. For a young woman who didn't have family to protect her, she had to be careful and watch out for herself in order to stay alive. Fong picked things up quickly. She talked less than she listened. She saw how politicians fought for power, how imperial family members rose and fell, and how people who looked weak often had power over emperors. In this situation, being patient was not a good thing. It was a gun. When she was chosen to be Emperor Wenchang's wife, her life changed. The match was political, not romantic, but it got Fun closer to the center of power than most women ever did. The empire went through a dangerous time when the emperor died too soon, leaving behind a child heir. Child emperors were regents. Regents meant fighting, and fighting often ended in blood. Fun, which was not expected, came out not as a victim, but as the answer. She was made Empress Daja and became the young emperor's regent. This change was very unusual. A woman whose family had been destroyed by court politics was now in charge of the same system that had killed them. But she didn't make decisions on the spur of the moment. She ruled carefully because she knew that in northern China, power didn't come from words, but from stability. From the start, Fun saw her power as a need, not a desire. She acted like a guardian of the dynasty, not its ruler. This difference was important. She stopped any opposition from forming by stressing continuity and order. What started as a regency during a crisis would turn into one of the most important times in Northern Wei history. And it all began with a girl who learned very early on that the first step to ruling was staying alive. Empress Fang knew something that a lot of other rulers didn't. It wasn't giving orders that gave you power, it was knowing how things worked. As regent, She didn't try to make big changes or show off her power right away. That would have been risky. The Northern Way court was controlled by powerful aristocratic families, military elites, and high-ranking officials who thought a female regent was only temporary at best and illegitimate at worst. The first thing Fun had to do was not rule. It was meant to last. She started by learning about the machinery of government, court rituals, the law, land management, and military appointments. None of these were ideas that weren't real. They were levers. Fun went to meetings quietly so that ministers could speak freely, which they did often and for a long time. This silence was planned. Officials talked about their goals, rivalries, and weaknesses without knowing they were being watched. As time went on, she learned who liked things to stay the same, who thrived on chaos, and who could only be trusted if you kept an eye on them. Fun didn't get rid of the court. Instead, he kept it. She kept experienced officials on staff, even those who didn't believe in her authority, because she wanted things to stay the same. More than loyalty in the beginning, changes that happened suddenly would have shown that someone was insecure. On the other hand, stability showed confidence. The court changed slowly. Ministers stopped holding out hope for a male regent to show up. They went straight to her with their problems. Fun also knew how important it was to be real. She was in a strange position because she was a non-Wobber woman in charge of a Shanbalid dynasty. She didn't fight it. Instead, she changed the way she thought about it. She stressed the Confucian ideas of moral government while respecting the traditions of the ruling class. This two-pronged strategy let her talk to both sides of the empire without making either side angry. It wasn't compromise, it was synthesis. Fun changed the way the palace worked behind the scenes. Eunuchs, which was often used as a power broker, was put under stricter control. Imperial relatives were kept close, but had little power in politics. The regent made it harder for factions to work together by spreading power across many offices. No one group was allowed to take over. Balance became the rule. Fun didn't look like it would last, which was probably the most important thing. She always said that her job was to be a temporary guardian, ruling only until the emperor turned 18. This made officials feel better and gave her space to act. In reality, she was already making decisions that would affect the future of the dynasty. But she did it quietly and patiently, gaining control not by scaring people, but by making things work. Fun was no longer just getting by in court by the end of this phase. She was in charge of it. And for the first time in years, the empire was stable. Empress Fang didn't think that government was only something that happened in palaces and memorials. To her, the rule began in the country. In the 5th century, northern China was scarred by decades of war, forced migrations, and uneven land control. Big clans got bigger estates, while small farmers went into debt, ran away, or became slaves. This imbalance couldn't last long in an empire. Fang knew that the state needed to fix its relationship with thee. If it lost its land, it would lose its people. One of her most important decisions was to make land regulation systems stronger and bigger. The court took back control of land distribution and taxes instead of letting aristocrats take over farmland without any checks. More care was taken when registering peasant households, which made sure that taxes were more evenly distributed and that local elites didn't randomly raise labor obligations. This was not just kindness, it was a plan. A stable tax base meant that taxes were stable. Having money coming in and knowing how much money would come in meant fewer military uprisings. Fun also tried to stop the abuse of corv labor. Farmers were the most important part of the dynasty's economy, but they had been treated like they didn't matter for a long time. She put limits on forced labor demands, especially during planting and harvest seasons. These changes may seem small, but they had a big impact. Villages that could grow their own food were less likely to run away or rebel. The empire became quieter, not because people were scared, but because life became easier to deal with. Fong also made central oversight stronger at the same time. Provincial governors were watched more closely, and their jobs were rotated so that no one could build up a local power base. Reports were made to be the same, which made it harder to hide corruption behind vague language. Officials who took advantage of peasants too openly were fired, not with a show, but with speed. The message was clear. The court had the power, not private estates. These changes also served a cultural purpose by putting the focus on moral governance and orderly administration. Fun brought the dynasty more in line with Chinese bureaucratic ideals. This helped the Northern Wei state fit in with the larger traditions of imperial rule, making it less likely that people thought it was just a conqueror regime imposed from outside. Fong made governance last by strengthening the connection between land, people, and the state. Her power was no longer based only on her role as regent. It was based on systems. That worked even when she wasn't there. And that was the start of lasting imperial reform, more than any other order. Empress Fang knew that faith could hold an empire together just as well as laws could. In a place where ethnic groups were at odds with each other, there had just been a war, and there was still distrust between the ruling elites and the people. Ideology was important. Fang didn't see religion as a place to escape or a way to show off in court. She thought of it as part of the state's infrastructure. Buddhism was already spreading across northern China and giving people a moral language. That went beyond clan and origin. Fang saw its political potential right away. During her reign, Buddhism got more support from the emperor than ever before. Monasteries grew, monks were kept safe, and religious groups were officially made part of the government. This wasn't blind support. Fun set rules for how monks could own land and made sure that temples stayed within those limits. The goal was to find a balance. Buddhism was supposed to help people live by good morals and bring communities together, not become a power that no one could touch. Feng's broader vision of governance fit well with Buddhist values of compassion, self-control, and moral authority. She pushed the idea that the ruler was more of a caretaker than a conqueror. This message worked especially well in areas that had just been taken over by Northern Way control, where people were still angry about military rule. Temples became places where people could learn, give to charity, and keep the peace. They fed the poor when there wasn't enough food, settled arguments, and strengthened people's loyalty to the state without needing for troops. Fun used Buddhism to prove her power as a woman in court. Instead of directly challenging patriarchal norms, she worked around them. Buddhist teachings provided examples of female virtue, spiritual authority, and moral guardianship. Fun redefined her power as righteous stewardship by linking her regency to religious merit and moral obligation. When she said she was following cosmic order, it was harder for critics to call her ambitious. This religious policy also helped to make things easier. Ethnic splits inside the empire. The ruling class in the north came from steppe traditions. Most people followed Chinese customs, but Buddhism, which neither group was born into, brought them together. It helped Fang bring together different groups of people under a common spiritual framework without forcing them to change their culture too quickly. Buddhism was no longer just a religion in the Northern Way by the time her policies were fully in place. It was a key part of the state, and through it, Fun strengthened unity and legitimacy and moral power without ever having to raise her sword or voice. Empress Fun knew that the biggest threat to the dynasty came from within, not from outside forces. There were a lot of powerful clans, ambitious generals, and imperial relatives at the Northern Way court who thought that being close to the throne gave them the right to have an impact. Past regents had tried to control this area by scaring people and killing them, which often led to the very rebellions they were trying to stop. Fun went a different way. She paid attention to control through structure instead of fear. One of her top goals was to take away some of the political power of her imperial relatives. In the past, regencies in China fell apart when uncles, cousins, or in-laws said they were in charge because of family ties. Fun reduced this risk by making sure that family members were close to the court but not in charge of anything. They were given titles, money, and ceremonial jobs. Symbols that don't mean anything. This method stopped anger and stopped the rise of rival groups. Places where power is. Fun also made the bureaucratic hierarchy better. It was made clear what each office's job was, what each person's job was, and who was in charge. Overlapping authority, which often leads to factional conflict, was intentionally reduced. Officials were told to focus on one area instead of trying to do well in many. This made running the government more efficient, and most importantly, made it harder to plan conspiracies. When everyone knew what they were supposed to do, it was easy to see when someone did something wrong. Fun also changed how choices were made. Instead of relying on informal influence, she demanded written memorials, documented procedures, and recorded results. This made the institution's memory stronger and made it harder for people to change policy by using their personal connections. Ministers who used to rely on their charm or fear found that paperwork and past decisions limited them. Power moved from people to processes. Fun made sure not to humiliate officials in public, which was very important, even when getting rid of corrupt or disloyal. She acted with restraint when it came to numbers. It was said that dismissals were administrative corrections, not moral crusades. This kept people from acting out of desperation and kept their dignity. The court was still tense, but it worked. Fun did something that doesn't happen very often with these methods. She made a court that was more afraid of chaos than of power. Everyone wanted stability. By the middle of her reign, those who were against her were no longer working together to get rid of her. Instead, it changed to fit the system she had made. The court still whispered. It always would, but whispers aren't as dangerous as swords. Empress Fun knew that regency was only meant to last for a short time, but she also knew that giving up power too quickly could destroy everything she had worked for. It was hard for her to face her challenge. Get the young emperor ready to rule, but make sure that the change doesn't bring back factional chaos. So, education became a political act. The emperor's upbringing was very planned from the time he was a child. Tutors were chosen not only for their teaching skills, but also for temperament. Fun stayed away from scholars who were known for having strict beliefs or personal goals. She liked teachers who stressed discipline, moral responsibility, and being good at managing things. The goal was not to be brilliant, but to be steady. An emperor didn't have to be great. He had to be able to be counted on. Fun also limited access. People who wanted to change the emperor had to go through many levels of supervision. Friendships in childhood were watched. There were rules about gifts. They even wrote down casual conversations. This wasn't being paranoid. It was to stop it. Fong had seen how easily young leaders could be used by people with more power. She wouldn't let someone whisper sweet things into a child's ear ruin her work. She also made sure not to completely cut off the emperor from everyone else. He slowly learned about court rituals, audiences, and how to run the government. Fun often sat quietly while he dealt with small issues, only stepping in when he had to. These times were educational. Mistakes were fixed in private, keeping the dignity of the empire. People said that the emperor was responsible for the successes. What people thought was important. The court needed to see a ruler being made, not a puppet acting. Fun slowly became less and less visible as the emperor grew older. Edicts, more and more, showed his power. Even when they were guided behind the scenes, audiences were seen as his choices. This slow change gave officials time to get used to it without panicking. There was no one moment when the transfer happened, and there was no empty space to take advantage of. Power moved instead of fell. But Fun never gave up control too soon. She still had the final say until she was sure that institutions, not people, would move the state forward. The court no longer revolved around her presence by the time she stepped back. It was based on the rules she had put in place for running the government every day. In making the emperor, Fun made sure that things stayed the same. She did not want to leave a legacy through monuments or public statements. Her legacy was less obvious. It lived in rules, habits, and expectations. The empire didn't shake when she finally let go. It stayed. During Empress Fun's reign, the Northern Wei dynasty was at a crossroads. The empire was getting bigger, but that put a lot of stress on it. The newly added areas had different languages, traditions, and loyalties. Military governors ran things far away from the capital. Old aristocracies remembered when they were free. The danger wasn't that it would fall apart right away, but that it would slowly break apart. Fun's job was to put these pieces together without making them all fit together too quickly. Then it could endure. Her approach relied on administrative integration rather than cultural erasure. Local elites were not removed wholesale. Instead, they were absorbed. Promising regional figures were offered court positions, marriages, or educational opportunities in the capital. This brought talent inward while weakening the appeal of regional separatism. Being loyal got you included, not scared. Over time, ambition redirected itself toward the center. Fun also strengthened communication between provinces and court. Regular reporting schedules were enforced. Messengers and inspection officials traveled more frequently, reducing the autonomy that distance once provided. Governors understood that neglect or abuse would not go unnoticed, even hundreds of miles away. This did not eliminate corruption, but it narrowed the space in which it could thrive. The same level of care was given to military authority. Fang respected the army's importance, but she avoided allowing generals to become political actors. Commands were rotated. Honors were distributed broadly rather than concentrated. Victories were celebrated as imperial achievements, not personal triumphs. She stopped warlords from forming by linking military prestige to the dynasty instead of to individuals. At the ideological level, Fun emphasized order and continuity. Laws were standardized across regions where possible, reducing confusion and resentment. Ritual practices were adjusted gradually, allowing local customs to coexist under imperial frameworks. The message was consistent. The empire did not demand sameness, only loyalty and stability. What made these efforts effective was restraint. Fun didn't try to fix every problem right away. She prioritized cohesion over perfection. Regions were allowed to adapt at different speeds as long as the direction remained clear. The state became less brittle, more flexible, by maintaining unity through administration, communication, and inclusion. Fun ensured that the Northern Wei Empire did not tear itself apart under the weight of its own growth. It stayed whole not because it had to, but because it worked. Empress Fun had to pay a price for the peace she brought. Long regencies rarely end without resentment, and Fun's was no exception. The empire was in order, the money coming in was steady, and there were few rebellions by the time she left office. But there was a lot of tension building up below the surface. People who had grown up completely under her control began to get angry with it. Younger courtiers who wanted to get ahead and impatient saw her continued power as a problem instead of a protection. Fun knew about this change. She had always known that power, when shown too much for too long, makes people want to fight back, no matter what. She didn't repress her response. Instead, she cut back on her involvement. She no longer took care of things herself. They were given to others. The number of people in court went down more and more. Decisions were made based on established procedures rather than personal instructions. This withdrawal was planned, but it was also dangerous. If she retreated too quickly, she might show weaknesses she had worked hard to hide for decades. There were also costs to the people involved. Fun didn't have a normal family life. Her job required her to be emotionally distant, always on the lookout, and have a public image of calmness that didn't allow for private grief or attachment. The court respected her, but not many people loved her. That loneliness was the cost of being needed. She had made herself unique by stabilizing the empire, and unique people are always alone. Criticism, which was once quiet, became more honest. Some people said she ruled for too long. Some people said that the dynasty had become dependent on her judgment. Fun did not say anything in public. She had learned early on that responding to every accusation only made it worse. Once more, silence was her shield, but she didn't blindly follow authority. Fun planned for the end of her reign as carefully as she did for the start of it. She made sure that the rules for succession were clear, that officials knew what they were supposed to do, and that no one group was ready to take over. In her last years, she spent less time coming up with new ideas and more time keeping old ones. When Feng's direct power finally faded, the empire didn't fall apart or celebrate. That calm ending was her last victory. The price of her power had been high, personal, and long-lasting, but it had saved the dynasty a lot more money. There was no dramatic last act from Empress Fun. There was no coup, no violent punishment, and no sudden loss of power. Instead, her. Leaving the center of power was almost anticlimactic, which was the whole point. Most of the time, empires show what kind of leaders they have not when they are strong, but when they leave. Fun passed this test. The Northern Wei state no longer needed her to be there to work by the time her influence was completely gone. The people in charge knew what they had to do. Governors of provinces knew what they could and couldn't do. The emperor ruled within a framework shaped by discipline rather than impulse. Not favoritism, but procedure was used to enforce the law. The court no longer waited for one person to tell it what to do. It moved in ways that Fun had spent decades teaching it to do. The most important thing she did was make everything fit together. She turned a dynasty of conquest into a functioning imperial system that could rule over a wide range of people. Agriculture was safeguarded, revenue stabilized, religion assimilated, and administration standardized. None of these changes were very big. By themselves, they worked together to make endurance. Fun's promotion of Buddhism had a lasting effect on culture that lasted long after she died. The conditions she set up allowed temples, art, and religious scholarship to thrive, which changed the spiritual landscape of northern China for generations. Her combination of steppe leadership traditions with Chinese bureaucratic governance, was just as important in changing the Northern Wei dynasty's identity and future. History has not always been kind to her. Afterward, chroniclers writing in male-dominated traditions often downplayed her role or portrayed her authority as unusual, but the stability of the mid-Northern Wei period speaks for itself. Empires don't stay together by chance. They last because they are well made. Fun was in charge without a crown, without starting a new dynasty, and without changing history to make herself look good. She used her power to hold back, not to show off. The state stayed calm when she stepped aside. That calm was her legacy. In a world where leaders are remembered for winning wars or losing them, Empress Fun is different. She was successful because she ruled in a way that people wouldn't have to remember her. The empire she built stayed strong, not because of who she was, but because of what she built. Crowns were never made just to look nice. In the past, they were there to help with a political problem that all early societies had: how to make authority clear right away. Power had to be clear, unquestionable, and obvious, especially in cultures where most people would never read laws or hear official announcements. A crown met that need with just one look. Before crowns, leaders had to rely a lot on their own reputation, being there in person or performing rituals. But as societies got bigger and more complicated, this wasn't enough anymore. Rulers had to show that they were in charge to people outside of their own group. They needed a sign that could speak for them when they were quiet, far away, or not seen. That symbol was the crown. It told people who were watching that power was not evenly shared before they spoke. Crowns worked well because they were different from how most people looked. They were on top of the head, which is the highest part of the body. This made it look like the ruler was closer to the heavens. This was not a mistake. Many ancient religions thought that the head was connected to the soul, reason, or God. Putting something there turned the ruler into something more than a person, part politician, part holy person. Vessel crowns also made abstract ideas into real things. Ideas like divine favor, ancestral right, cosmic balance, or imperial unity can't be seen on their own. A crown made them stand out. Gold made things seem permanent. Gems suggested power from the heavens. Height showed power. Even being simple could mean being moral and holding back. Every design choice said something about why people should obey a ruler. It is important to note that crowns were not interchangeable decorations. They were tightly controlled symbols that were often limited by law or custom. It wasn't fashionable to wear a crown without permission. It was rebellious. This exclusivity made them even more powerful. When only one person in a society could wear a certain crown, that object became a symbol of power. Crowns also had an effect on people's minds. They taught people to connect looks with power. People learned to follow the symbol as well as the person wearing it over time. This made the rule more stable. Even a weak or far-off ruler could get respect as long as the crown remained whole and clear. In this way, Crowns were not just for show, they were tools for ruling. They turned power, belief, and hierarchy into one thing that could be seen, remembered, and feared. Before there were written constitutions or standing armies, the crown made rule possible by making power clear. In ancient Egypt, a crown was never just a sign of status. It was a statement about how the universe was put together. The idea behind Egyptian kingship was that the king didn't just rule people but kept the delicate balance between order and chaos. The crown was the most obvious sign that this balance was being kept. The double crown, which was made up of two older crowns, was the most powerful of these symbols. The red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt. They made a single headdress that showed unity when they were put together. When you wore it, you were saying that you were in charge of all the land from the southern Nile to the Mediterranean delta. Political geography became something you could wear. Theology. This was important because ancient Egypt wasn't naturally unified. The Nile Valley made people feel like they belonged to a certain region, and breaking up was always a possibility. The double crown made unity a holy state instead of a temporary political arrangement. The cosmos required it, not because borders were protected, but because the king wore it. The crown also made the pharaoh seem more like a god. In general, Egyptian rulers were not gods. They were living pipes between the world of people and the world of gods. The crown made the pharaoh look taller and connected his body to the gods above and the land below. This is why crowns were always present in temple reliefs and statues. It was rare for the ruler to be shown without a hat. To show a pharaoh without a crown was to show him as not fully formed. Different crowns were used for different religious ceremonies. Some stressed fertility and new life. Some people talked about military power or judgment. Changing crowns was not the same as changing costumes. It was a change in roles. The king changed his symbolic identity based on what part of the cosmic order he was playing, so the coronation wasn't just one event. It was a series of changes, each marked by a crown. Continuity was what made Egyptian crowns so powerful. For thousands of years, people could still tell what they were. There were many dynasties that came and went, but the way kings looked stayed the same. This stability made people think that Egypt itself would last forever, even if the rulers did not. The crown did not in Egypt. It didn't say, "I rule." Instead, it said, "The world is still in balance." As long as that crown stayed on the pharaoh's head, chaos was kept at bay, at least in a symbolic way. In Persia, crowns meant something different than they did in Egypt. Egyptian crowns focused on cosmic balance, while Persian royal headgear focused on scale. The kings of the Achaemenid Empire did not claim to be the protectors of a single holy land. Instead, they ruled over many different peoples, languages, and customs. All at once, their crowns were made to show that they had power over everyone, not just over their own people. Persian kings didn't like crowns that were too tall. Instead, they wore structured headgear that was often called tiaras or diadems, soft caps or curlets, and sometimes they were tied with ribbons or reinforced with gold. This restriction was intentional. The Persian kingship was based on the idea that the king was above all nations, not gods above people. The king ruled by the will of God, but he was not God himself. This difference had political significance. The Ammid Empire ruled over a huge and varied group of people that lived from Anatolia to Central Asia. It would have been a disaster to force everyone to have the same religious identity. Instead, Persian crowns stood for legitimate power. The supreme god Ahura Mazda gave the right to rule, but it was carried out through law, tolerance, and administration. Royal reliefs from Pepololis always show the king wearing the same controlled headgear, while delegations from subject peoples come to see him in their own unique ways. Clothes. The message is strong, but not obvious. There is diversity, but the hierarchy stays the same. The crown is the only thing that stands above everything else. It doesn't erase differences, it holds them. The Persian crown also moved. The king's headgear made it easy for people to tell who he was, even when he wasn't wearing fancy clothes. This was important in an empire where the emperor was always on the move. It was important for authority to be able to move. The crown turned into a moving throne, known in all of the provinces. Color and material strengthened ideas. Rich, but not too much, decoration suggested wealth without being too showy. Symmetry made things look neat. Not being very tall kept people from thinking of tyranny. Persian kings wanted people to obey them, not be scared of them. Their crown gave orders by staying calm. The Persian crown was probably most important because it was so closely tied to the idea of kingship. To go against the king was more than just going against a person. It was to go against the right order of the empire. Claimants who couldn't get royal insignia were seen as frauds, no matter what their bloodline was. The crown in Persia did not say it was holy. It said it was the only real power in the world. It said softly but firmly that the king's power did not stop at one land, but could go anywhere it was recognized. In Greece, crowns had a strange contradiction. Power was real, but its signs were kept to a minimum on purpose. Most Greek societies were not like Egypt or Persia. People in societies were very wary of monarchy. People thought that authority should be temporary, accountable, and earned, not passed down from one generation to the next. Because of this, Greek crowns didn't often mean permanent rule. They stood for momentary greatness instead. Greek crowns were often made of wreaths, made of ivy, laurel, oak, or olive. These materials were meant to be organic, weak, and easy to break. A wreath could die, break, or be thrown away. That was the point of the impermanence. In Greek thought, no one person was meant to be in charge forever. Even the biggest successes were only short-lived moments of glory. This symbolism was most clear in sports and religious settings. Winners of games were not given gold crowns, but leaves. The crown was a sign of success, not power. It made the person feel better for a short time, then brought them back to the same level. In this way, the Greek crown honored merit without upsetting the social order. When kings were around in Greece, they were mostly in the early days or on the edges of Greece. In their culture, Their crowns were not very flashy. Even powerful leaders stayed away from too much regalia. People would call you a tyrant if you looked too high up. Greek political culture linked tall crowns and stiff headgear with Eastern desperation. A ruler who looked too much like a god had gone too far. It's interesting that Greek gods were crowned with more expensive crowns than Greek rulers. Divine figures wore crowns, wreaths, or elaborate headpieces that made it clear they were not human. This strengthened an important limit. Gods could be forever and without end. People couldn't do that. A human being who dressed like a god was going against the natural order. This split had a big effect on Greek political thought. People thought that authority should be clear, but not too strong. Instead of showing dominance, symbols though had to show restraint. Even later, Hellenistic rulers who wore more ornate crowns after Alexander the Great's conquests had trouble with this tension. Their crowns were based on Persian designs, but Greek audiences never fully accepted them as normal. In Greece, not having a permanent crown was a statement in and of itself. It said that the community, not the person, had the power. Being a leader was a job, not who you were. The crown was light enough to take off when it did show up. This refusal to accept crowned permanence would be heard all over the world. It put the idea in people's heads that authority could exist without a divine costume, a thought that would later put empires built on gold, height, and show to the test. A crown in ancient Rome was risky, not because it was weak, but because it stood for the wrong kind of power. Roman politics were based on a strong dislike of kingship. For hundreds of years, people remembered the monarchs who had to leave, which led to a system in which authority had to be explained as service to the state, not control over others. Because of this, wearing a crown in Rome didn't mean you were legitimate. It was an accusation. Early Roman leaders didn't wear crowns at all. Even generals who won celebrated in. Victors did not wear crowns. Instead, they were given temporary awards. Wreaths, laurel crowns, or civic crowns were given for certain actions, like saving Roman citizens. These were rewards, not demands. They raised the level of achievement without suggesting that they would always be in charge. This difference was very important. In Rome, power was meant to be shared, institutional, and able to be taken away. Magistrates served for set periods of time. Theoretically, even dictators gave up power after emergencies were over. A crown made me think of something else. Completely. Permanence, personal freedom, and being above the law. That was not okay. The most tense time was during the late Republic. As people gained more power than ever before, the meaning of crowns became very important. People were shocked when Julius Caesar was given a crown. He pretended to refuse, but the message was clear. If he had accepted a crown, it would have confirmed fears that Rome was going back to being a monarchy. Caesar was killed soon after, not because he wore a crown, but because a lot of people thought he would. After the fall of the Republic, Roman emperors had a symbolic problem. They acted like kings, but they couldn't look like kings. early emperors didn't wear crowns. Instead, they wore simple headbands or wreaths. There wasn't one thing that showed authority. Instead, it was shown through titles, military command, and rituals. Later, when the empire was stronger, crowns slowly started to look like Roman ones again. Even then, they were carefully framed. Crowns stood for victory, divine favor, or cosmic order, but never open kingship. Even when it wasn't true, the emperor was shown as the first citizen. Rome's troubled relationship with crowns shows something important. Symbols don't just show power, they also test it. A crown did not make a ruler stronger in Rome. It left him open to attack. That fear made people in power dress carefully, cautiously, and always aware that one wrong symbol could bring down an empire for hundreds of years. In the early days of the Chinese Empire, crowns were never intended to impress. They were meant to teach. Chinese imperial headgear was different from the gold-heavy regalia of other civilizations in that it stressed restraint, balance, and moral responsibility. Excess did not prove authority. Self-control did. A crown on a ruler's head was a visual reminder that power was there to keep things in order, not to boost their ego. The Myeongwon, a ceremonial crown with hanging beads that partially covered the emperor's face, was the most famous type of Chinese imperial headwear. This design was intentional and full of meaning. The strands in front reminded the ruler to stay away from bad sights. People in the back told people not to speak carelessly. The crown made it harder for the emperor to use his senses, which supported the idea that a real ruler ruled by discipline rather than impulse. This symbolism represented a more general political philosophy. In Chinese philosophy, legitimacy was not derived solely from conquest. It came from being morally in line with heaven. People thought that the ruler should be the link between the order of the universe and human society. If heaven backed him up because he ruled fairly. Heaven took away its mandate if he ruled badly. So the crown didn't mean that the right was permanent. It was based on conditions. The materials added to this message. Chinese crowns were often simple in shape, with a focus on symmetry and proportion rather than height or showiness. They didn't show off, even when they were made of expensive materials. Too much showing off was linked to moral decline. A ruler who dressed too extravagantly was showing that things weren't right, and things weren't right meant trouble. There were also strict rules about crowns. Certain styles were only allowed in certain ceremonies, rituals, or times of year. It was a big deal to wear the wrong crown at the wrong time. This made the hierarchy stronger and reminded everyone, even the emperor, that authority had to follow the rules. The crown did not free the king from his duties, it tied him to it. Chinese crowns stressed continuity over individuality, which is important. There wasn't much change from one reign to the next. The ruler wasn't as important than the part he played. This made people less likely to form personal cults of personality and strengthened the idea that the state would outlast any one emperor. In this system, the crown did not say it was in charge. It wanted people to be responsible. It said that the rule was not a privilege to enjoy, but a burden to carry out correctly. When that burden was not handled properly, the crown itself lost its meaning and became a hollow symbol of authority that heaven no longer recognized. In ancient China, the crown did not make the ruler better than others. It put him under it. Crowns were much less important in the societies of early medieval Northern Europe, especially during the Viking Age, when Scandinavia was the center of power. There were no tall crowns or symbols of divine kingship with gems on them. Power in the North was negotiated, personal, and always being tested. Because of this, crowns were less tools of power and more signs of respect. Viking leaders did not only rule by divine right, they were in charge because other people agreed with them. Leadership. Kings were in charge of wars, making laws, and giving gifts. Their power came from their reputation, success, and willingness to help others. A leader who didn't bring victory or riches quickly lost followers. In a system like this, a fancy crown wouldn't have meant much without loyalty to back it up. Crowns or circlets were only worn during meetings, rituals, or diplomacy, and they were usually thin bands of metal, like silver or bronze. These weren't things that were meant to awe. They marked status in a social setting. Contract. The crown admitted that a man had been chosen, but not that he was untouchable. It could just as easily be taken away as given. This symbol fit with how people in the North thought about leadership. Kings were the first among equals, not gods who spoke for them. Even famous kings and queens were expected to listen at meetings and stand up for their choices. So, the crown did not make the person who wore it above the law. It made him responsible for keeping it. Mythology helped keep this in check. Northern gods wore helmets or circlets in battle, but even they had to follow fate. No crown protected against fate. This way of thinking didn't like absolute power. Power was not permanent. It was based on actions that were done over and over again. As Christianity spread north, the meaning of crowns slowly changed. Christian kings wore more formal clothes that were based on Roman and continental styles. Crowns came to mean God's approval instead of the community's. But even then, old ways of doing things stayed around. Kings in the north were crowned, but they were also supposed to keep proving themselves through war and rule. The difference is telling. The crown in the north followed power instead of making it. It recognized leadership that was already there instead of making it up. This made crowns less important, but it also made them more honest. Instead of forcing their beliefs on others, they showed what was real. In these societies, a crown alone did not command obedience. It confirmed that obedience had already been given and could be taken away if the ruler didn't deserve it. Not all people made crowns out of metal or gold in the past. In many cultures, the most powerful crowns were not made of long-lasting materials, but instead were made of feathers, light, or ritual authority. These crowns were important not because they lasted physically, but because they linked rulers to powers that were thought to be beyond the human world. In ancient Mesoamerica, crowns were often very fancy feathered headdresses. Feathers from rare birds were worth more than precious metals. Because they stood for the sky, the sun, and divine breath. Wearing such a crown meant that you were a part of cosmic energy. The gods didn't just choose the ruler, he looked like he was one with them. These headdresses were weak and only lasted for a short time, which made people think that power was always changing and needed to be renewed through ritual and sacrifice. In South Asia, crowns had a different meaning. Dharma, the moral law that governs the universe, was connected to kingship. Crowns were a sign of the ruler's duty to keep this order instead of ruling over people. Some rulers were shown with glowing halos or stylized crowns of light, which made it seem like they were spiritually enlightened rather than having material power. In this case, the crown was less of an object and more of a sign that the person was in line with cosmic truth. There was one thing that all of these traditions had in common. Power was not absolute. When a ruler lost God's favor or moral balance, they didn't just lose political support. He lost his place in the universe. The crown, whether it had feathers or couldn't protect him, even though it was a symbol. In fact, it often made his failure worse by making the fall more dramatic and more public. It was important to renew the ritual. During ceremonies, crowns were worn, taken off afterward, and sometimes even destroyed on purpose. This kept rulers from mixing up temporary power with permanent right. Power was given to people, not owned. Every coronation reaffirmed the link between the ruler, the people, and the world that can't be seen. These crowns that aren't made of metal go against what we think about power today. They make us think of that authority doesn't need to be permanent to work. In some cultures, being durable was a bad thing. A crown that couldn't decay might have made people think of power that couldn't be questioned. These cultures stressed an uncomfortable truth by moving away from metal and stone. Rule is weak. It only exists as long as people believe in it. Their crowns were lighter, shorter, and often more honest. They did not say they would last forever. They asked for renewal. Crowns looked very different in different ancient cultures. Different, but they did the same important thing. They made ideas that weren't visible into things that were. No matter what it was made of, gold, leaves, feathers, or light, a crown answered a question that every society had to deal with. What makes this person a good leader? The answer was different each time, but the reasoning was the same. The crown said that the universe was in balance in Egypt. In Persia, it claimed power over differences. In Greece, its absence served as a caution against permanence. It threatened death in Rome. It held the ruler back with morals in China. In the North, it confirmed recognition instead of command. In other places, crowns turned into rituals of renewal, reminding everyone that power could fade just as easily as it appeared. The one thing that all of these traditions have in common is that crowns were never neutral. They were fights. Each crown asserted a perspective on the essence of authority. Was power divine or conditional, eternal or temporary, personal or institutional? The shape, material, and rules of a crown made political ideas clearer than any written document. Law that most people would read. Crowns also show something deeper about early states. Power was weak. Rulers could tell armies what to do, but they couldn't make people believe what they wanted. A crown helped keep beliefs stable by getting its shape. People followed both the person and the symbol. As time went on, obedience moved from the person to the office and from the ruler to the role. That change made it possible for empires to grow. But crowns also had their own risks. When symbols grew too big for reality, they became problems. A crown worn without authority invited resistance. A crown worn too boldly showed fear of authority. There are many rulers in history who learned too late that symbols need to be consistent. When faith breaks down, the crown becomes just a decoration, and decorations can't rule. This might be the most important lesson. Crowns did not give people power, they made it shorter. They only worked when institutions, belief systems, and social consent were behind them. When those things fell apart, crowns fell with them, sometimes even literally. In the end, old crowns were like mirrors. They showed what people thought about justice, hierarchy, and the limits of human power. Take away the golden feathers, and what you have left is a problem that all people have. How to explain why people should obey without using force. One answer was crowns. Not perfect or universal, but strong enough to change civilizations and weak enough to remind us that rules, like beliefs, must always be kept. The Great Wall of China was never meant to be one long monument. It started as an idea that came from fear, geography, and being broken up. Before China was one empire, it was a place where many states fought for control of their borders against nomadic raiders and other states. These early defenses were simple, like packed earth walls, trenches, and wooden fences, but they set a pattern that would last for hundreds of years. The wall wasn't meant to be a sign. It began as a response. In the northern plains, borders were weak and easy to change. Horse-mounted raiders could move faster than armies, hit hard, and then disappear before the attack came back. Walls could do something that armies couldn't: delay. A low embankment could slow down horses, direct their movement, and give defenders time to react. These early barriers weren't meant to completely stop invasions. They were meant to mold them, each state built on its own, using its own methods and priorities. Some walls followed the lines of ridges, while others followed rivers or cut across open land. The materials were useful and came from the area: earth that has been rammed, reeds, gravel, and wood. There wasn't a single design because there was no common goal. What brought these efforts together was need. Defense had turned into architecture when the state of Qin began to rise, taking over rivals and bringing together land. It got these pieces. Qin didn't take them apart. Instead, he connected and expanded them. This wasn't done because they wanted to make it look good. It was a planned choice. The northern border was still open, and the newly unified empire couldn't afford to be unstable so soon after it was formed. Walls that used to separate Chinese states were used again to keep the empire and the steppe apart. This change was a turning point. The wall was no longer about staying alive in the area. It turned into a border for the empire. People were put to work on a scale that had never been seen before. Soldiers, conscripts, convicts, and peasants were sent north to strengthen, expand, and connect defenses. The work was hard, often deadly, and never ending. But the logic was clear, and the empire needed to have edges. What came out was not just one wall, but a whole system, a landscape built for protection. Watchtowers. Next came signal fires, garrisons, and supply routes. The wall turned into infrastructure instead of architecture. It was made to be used, fixed, and rebuilt. When later generations talked about the Great Wall, they weren't talking about a time when it was being built. They were talking about a tradition of using earth and stone to respond to threats, a custom that would last through many dynasties, hundreds of years, and many lives. The wall entered a new phase when the Qin state finished bringing China together. This phase was marked by size, speed, and cost to people. With Qin Shi Huang in charge, defense was no longer a problem for the whole region. It was something that the empire was very interested in. The northern border was the only place where the newly unified state could be seriously threatened, and the Qin leadership responded with brutal force. The emperor told the builders to connect, strengthen, and lengthen the walls that were already there to make a continuous line of defense. This wasn't a project meant to show loyalty. It was a logistical order based on fear of nomadic groups. Past the step, speed was more important than comfort. Durability was more important than lives. Labor was taken on a scale never seen before. A lot of people were sent north, people who were soldiers, peasants, prisoners, or political enemies. Many were forced to serve for years at a time. Families were torn apart. Villages lost their workers. The empire didn't build the wall because it had a lot of resources. It did it because it was ruthless about getting people to work. The way things were built showed that they were in a hurry, using rammed earth techniques, builders, putting soil, gravel, and reeds on top of each other to make hard masses. When stone was available, it was used, but earth was the main material. The land itself shaped the wall, following ridges and choke points to make the most of its defensive value, while making it easier to move materials. This wasn't a good example of engineering. It was enforced efficiency. Life on the wall was hard. Workers had to deal with extreme cold, hunger, tiredness, and sickness. A lot of people died and were buried near the construction sites, which led to later stories that the wall was built at the top. Bones of people. Even though they were exaggerated, these stories told the truth. The wall took lives as easily as it took earth. The Qin state used ideology to explain this cost. The emperor had complete power, and the suffering of individuals was not important compared to the survival of the empire. That way of thinking was shown in the wall. It was long, hard, and didn't care about the people who built it. The Qin dynasty, on the other hand, didn't last long. Soon after the emperor died, there was a rebellion, which was partly caused by the very hard work that made the wall possible, but the structure stayed strong. Later dynasties got not only the wall's foundations, but also its logic. When an empire builds a wall this big, it's hard to leave it behind. The Qin phase of the Great Wall set a standard. It showed that the state could change geography just by giving orders. It also showed how much it would cost to do so. From now on, the wall would never be made of just stone and dirt. It would always be remembered as a monument built by the powerful and paid for by the people. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, later rulers learned a hard lesson. An empire can't be protected by walls alone. The first Qin walls were very big, but they were weak without constant support. The Great Wall changed from a simple wall to a living system during the Han Dynasty, one that can see, talk to, and control space instead of just blocking it. The Han had to deal with the same threats from the north, especially mobile steppe groups that could outmaneuver them. Defenses that don't move. Han planners didn't just look at height and thickness, they also made the walls that support infrastructure bigger. Watchtowers were built at regular intervals so that they could be seen from a long way away. From these towers, soldiers looked for movement, dust clouds, and smoke on the horizon, early warnings that were more important than stone. During the time of cavalry warfare, signal systems became the wall's nervous system. Fires at night, smoke during the day, and flags or drums when the weather was nice helped messages get across great. At a very fast pace, a single sighting could set off a chain of alerts that went hundreds of miles, getting garrisons ready long before the enemy reached settled land. In this way, the wall worked more like an early warning system than a stopgap. Garrisons were built right into the wall. Soldiers lived along the border all year and farmed land nearby to feed themselves. This made it easier to get supplies and made sure that the military was always at the border. The wall turned into a harsh, isolated, and disciplined living space. Life there was boring, with long periods of silence and sudden alarms. The Han also used the wall to control how people moved. Gates and passes controlled trade, diplomacy, and people moving from one place to another. The wall didn't completely shut China off. It filtered out interactions. Merchants went through checkpoints. People kept an eye on envoys. Nomadic leaders made deals at certain crossings. Because of this, the wall became a tool for shaping China's policy toward the world outside. This time was a change in ideas. The wall was no longer just a way to protect. It was management that spread out over the land. It set the limits of imperial power and where it ended. The Han made sure the wall would last by turning it into a system instead of a structure. Networks lasted even though stone could break. Observation, communication, and control turned the Great Wall into something more complex and useful than just a line of defense. The Great Wall didn't grow steadily. It grew and shrank in cycles, going up and down with the fortunes of the dynasties that took it over. After the Han period, the emperor's focus turned inward. Because of civil wars, fragmentation, and changing political priorities, large parts of the wall were left to the wind and erosion. Grass grew over the walls. The watchtowers fell down. In a lot of places, the wall quietly went back to the ground where it had been built during times of division, like the centuries between the Han and the Tang northern defense, became a problem again in the area. Smaller states fixed some parts of their own areas while completely ignoring others. The wall broke, just like the political scene. Things that survived did so not because of centralized planning, but because some frontier zones were still useful for military purposes. When reunification happened later, the wall came back into imperial thought, but only with caution. During the Sui dynasty, huge construction projects put a lot of stress on the people, and rulers learned from Qin history that too much forced labor might make the state less stable. Wool repair went on, but it was no longer a huge obsession that took up all of their time. The Tang dynasty took things even further. Tang rulers didn't rely as much on walls as they did on mobile armies, alliances, and forward control of frontier regions because they were sure of their military strength and diplomatic skills. In this time, the wall was less of a physical barrier and more of a symbolic line that showed how older empires worked. Some parts were kept up, but many others were left alone for generations. This pattern shows an important truth. There was never a time when the Great Wall was certain to happen. It got bigger when leaders were scared, and smaller when they were sure of themselves. It wasn't a constant shield, it was a reflection of how people thought about politics. Strong dynasties liked to be able to change. Weaker ones liked stone better. Environmental forces kept working, even though the empire wanted them to stop. Wind, rain, and cycles of freezing and thawing turned the earth walls into low ridges. The wall only stayed up in places where later dynasties rebuilt it in stone, form that can be seen. In other places, it lived on only in records, local memory, and stories. At this point, the wall was something strange. It was old but not finished, big but not always the same, and powerful in reputation but not always in reality. Each dynasty decided how much of it to keep and how much to throw away. The Great Wall was not a choice that was made over and over again. Fear, confidence, and the limits of state power talked to each other over hundreds of years. The Ming Dynasty made the Great Wall look the way we know it best. Dynasty, not because the threat was new, but because the fear was back. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty fell, the Ming rulers took over an empire that had been badly hurt by foreign rule. The northern frontier used to be run from Beijing by steppe elites, but now it was a source of worry instead of growth. The Ming had to have the wall. It was a way of saying goodbye. The Ming rebuilt the wall with stone and brick instead of the earthworks that earlier dynasties used a lot. This was a planned change. Stone stood strong where the earth wore away. Brick stood up to the weather, time, and attacks. The Ming Wall wasn't meant to slow things down. It was supposed to hold. The wall became a real fortress system thanks to thick parapets, crenellations, and reinforced towers. Construction was done in a planned way and was suited to each area. The wall followed the ridge lines in the mountains, and when it met cliffs, it became almost invisible from far away. It rose high and looked strong in flat areas, with deep foundations to keep it from falling down. The watchtowers were moved closer together so that they could keep a closer eye on things and respond more quickly. Artillery platforms were combined, showing how important gunpowder weapons were becoming. Life along the Ming Wall was very strict. Soldiers were stationed permanently, usually in military families that had been there for generations. They spent a lot of time on routine patrols, drills, maintenance, and waiting. The wall wasn't just a wall, it was a place of work. Villages grew around garrisons, bringing food, work, and replacements. The frontier changed from a wild edge to a managed zone. The Ming Wall also made border control more official. Passes were made into monuments, turning places where people could enter into ceremonial gates and defensive choke points. Trade was allowed, but there were rules about it. There was diplomacy at controlled crossings. The wall didn't completely cut China off, it organized contact. But this huge investment showed a change in strategy. The Ming chose to defend themselves instead of growing. Instead of showing power outward, they made the boundaries stronger on the inside. The wall was both a military asset and a mental comfort. People say that the empire knew where it ended and planned to stay there. People remember this version of the Great Wall the most, not because it was the first, but because it was the best example of a long held desire to turn fear into buildings and permanence into stone. For most of its history, the Great Wall was not seen as a monument, but as a place to work. Tens of thousands of soldiers lived along its length, often for their whole adult lives, guarding a border that was peaceful most of the time. The common idea that there is always fighting is wrong. The truth was that they had to be strong, deal with long periods of boredom and loneliness, and follow a routine that was broken up by short bursts of fear. Life in the garrison was very strict, especially during the Ming period. Soldiers had to stick to strict schedules that included patrols of certain areas, keeping walls and towers in good shape, weapon drills, and practicing signaling. Every. There were set duties for the watchtower. They had to get ready for fires. It was important to keep signal materials dry. If an alarm didn't go off, a moment of carelessness could mean disaster. The wall needed constant attention. The weather broke bricks and loosened stones. Wind blew sand into the crenellations. Rain weakened the foundations. Soldiers were not only fighters, they were also builders. They spent a lot of time fixing what nature was slowly trying to destroy. There was nothing heroic about defense. It was the same thing over and over. Being alone was hard. Garrisons were often far away from cities and families. Some soldiers lived with their wives and kids, making semi-permanent communities on the frontier. Some people lived alone or with other soldiers, far away from the inside world for months. It took a long time for letters to get to their destination. Supplies came in fits and starts. Winters were very hard. When it finally happened, the real fighting was quick and crazy. Raiding parties looked for weak spots by probing instead of attacking directly. The wall didn't always stop invasions completely, but it made enemies show themselves. Alarms gave people time. It was possible to call in reinforcements. Most encounters ended in small fights instead of full blown sieges. The wall also had a big effect on the psychology of defense. Instead of chasing, soldiers were taught to watch. People were told not to leave the wall to chase enemies. The structure put limits on what could be done. Instead of chasing after each other, it turned war into observation, signaling, and coordination. In this way, the wall kept both enemies and defenders in line. For the men who were there, loyalty was hard. They fought for the empire, but they often felt far away from it. They didn't have time for glory. They were too busy with maintenance and waiting, but the wall didn't mean anything without them. Stone couldn't see. The towers couldn't make up their minds. The wall only worked because people put up with what it wanted. People often forget about this layer of people, but the Great Wall was never just a line on the ground. It was a lived in place that was cold, tiring, and repetitive. Soldiers whose names were rarely written down, but whose presence made it work. The whole system could work. Stories filled in the gaps long after parts of the Great Wall fell down or stopped working. The wall was no longer just for defense. It turned into a container for memory, sorrow, and meaning. For hundreds of years, people didn't explain how big it was by talking about policy or logistics. They told stories. Stone alone could not explain something so big. The stories had to finish the work. The story of Mingjongu is the most famous of these. Her husband was taken to work on the wall and never came back. Legend has it that her sadness was so strong that it caused part of the wall to fall down, exposing his bones. The story isn't real, but it lived on because it told the truth. The wall took lives, tore families apart, and asked people to give up things they didn't get much in return for. Myth gave those losses a voice. These kinds of stories made the wall look less bad while still condemning it. The wall was both a sign of the state's cruelty and a sign of people's strength. People loved it and were afraid of it, and they mourned it. Respected, the wall listened in stories. It remembered, it punished people who were full of themselves and gave rewards to people who were loyal. These were moral frameworks used on something that wasn't human. Poets and scholars added to it even more. For them, the wall stood for the space between the center and the frontier, the ruler and the soldier, and civilization and the wilderness. It was a place of exile, duty, and longing in verses. Being against the wall meant being away from home and losing years of silence. The emotional toll stayed even when there was no fight. Over time, the meaning of the wall changed again. The wall stopped being an active border in many places as dynasties came and went and threats changed, but it didn't go away from cultural memory. Instead, it turned into a symbol. It came to stand for strength, togetherness, and the past. Ideas that had nothing to do with what it was made for, but everything to do with how later generations needed to learn about the past. This change is important. The Great Wall outlived the fears that made it by changing into something else. Completely. It changed from military infrastructure to cultural heritage. Its stones no longer warned of an attack, they warned against forgetting. In this way, The wall's best feature wasn't its ability to protect, it told a story. Even though it was broken and left behind, it still changed how people thought about power, suffering, and time. The empire that built it is no longer around. The stories didn't. And so the wall lasted, not just in the real world, but also in people's minds. The Great Wall was never too big or too symbolic, a shield that couldn't be broken. It worked well in some situations, but not in others. Its biggest weakness wasn't how tall or thick it was, but how much it relied on others. The wall only worked when the state behind it was strong, organized, and willing to keep it up. When those conditions changed, stone didn't protect very well. The wall's strategic value dropped sharply by the end of the imperial period, especially during the Qing dynasty. The Qing rulers came from outside the wall. They didn't take over China not by breaking through walls, but by going through gates that were opened by political collapse, corruption, and betrayal. The lesson was very clear and harsh. Walls don't keep enemies out who are invited in. Even before that, nomadic groups had repeatedly gone around or destroyed the wall. They paid off guards, took advantage of weakly defended passes, or just went around parts that weren't finished. The wall was strongest where the state was, and weakest where people stopped paying attention. During times of famine, rebellion, or financial stress, maintenance fell apart, and towers empty. Signals failed. The wall was still there, but it was empty. This revealed a deeper truth. The Great Wall was never a replacement for diplomacy, military readiness, or stability within the country. It made strength stronger, but it couldn't replace it. When the court was together and responsive, the wall worked as it should, slowing down attacks, buying time, and changing how people got involved. The wall became a long reminder of how things got out of hand when the court broke up. By the 18th and 19th centuries, improvements in warfare made it even less useful. Artillery could break stone, modern logistics let armies get around defenses that were not moving. The wall became useless, not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer useful. It was still there, but it didn't decide what happened anymore. But failure didn't take away meaning. The wall's failure to protect the king did not lessen its historical importance. Instead, it put it in a different light. The Great Wall became a symbol of how far defensive thinking can go. The notion that security could be attained solely through barriers. History indicated otherwise. When empires relied too much on walls, it was often when they were already losing faith. The wall was built to protect people from fear, not to get rid of it. Its problems weren't with the building itself, they were political. In this way, the Great Wall's fall as a way to protect people was also its last lesson. Power does not last because it makes walls taller. It lasts because it controls people, resources, and its own legitimacy. When those fail, even the longest wall in the world turns into a road for history to cross. When the Great Wall stopped being a useful military system, it had already become something much bigger than what it was meant to be. What was left was not a line of defense, but a historical presence that stretched across mountains, deserts, and memory. The wall no longer told people where danger began. It showed where history had gone. The Great Wall is amazing, not because it worked perfectly, but because someone tried to build it at all. Not many states in human history tried to keep geography in place for hundreds of years. The wall is a sign of an ongoing fight between land and power, between freedom and control. Every dynasty that fixed or added to it thought for a short time that they could make it last. The wall never really froze the world outside of it. It was crossed by cultures. Armies went over it. It was full of ideas. The wall slowed down, channeled, and recorded those crossings. It left scars on the land where politics and terrain met. You can still see those scars today. The meaning of the wall changed over time. What started as a line between inside and outside turned into a sign of group identity. The wall became a symbol of strength, permanence, and size, qualities that later generations valued, far from the fears that built it. Patrols were replaced by tourism. Watchfires were replaced by photography. The wall changed from an instrument to an inheritance. This change also made it less violent. The deaths, forced labor, and pain that made the wall possible faded into abstractness. Stones stayed, names didn't. The wall became more impressive in part because its cost was no longer clear. That distance is not comfortable, but honest monuments often last longer than their human cost. But the wall still teaches. It teaches that when states feel unsafe, they build things. You can put that fear into architecture. That power often chooses stability over adaptability, even when adaptability would be more beneficial. The wall shows both ambition and limitation in the same line. Made of stone, the Great Wall didn't keep China safe forever, though, but it did something that doesn't happen very often. It kept track of how long an empire tried. It shows hundreds of years of decisions, work, and beliefs stacked on top of each other. The wall keeps going, with parts that are broken and parts that are whole. It no longer guards an empire. Instead, it guards a question: what people will do to feel safe, and what they leave behind when safety is only temporary.